The following is a presentation from the 9th Annual Humanities Days at Montgomery College. The Human in Humanities, Understanding Ourselves and Others. This year we offered 30 remote events via Zoom. To learn more about Humanities Days at Montgomery College and to access other program recordings, please go to this website.
Thank you for this slide, Jennifer Baugh. I appreciate you creating it for me. I'd also like to give honor to the person who created the image that you see there on the left. And that image was created for me by a young artist named Sasha Martoni. Unfortunately, Sasha died this past summer in childbirth. She was 30 years old. She and her daughter died. I commissioned this piece right after the COVID pandemic started, and she had just moved to Atlanta. So we want to just give honor to her. I will put her artist page in the chat a little bit later on. Her Instagram handle is Don't Touch My Hair. Again, her name is Sasha Martoni, SASHAMARTONI, Martoni. So just giving honor to her as she joins the ancestors. I would also like to give further thanks a little bit later on, but as we move through this presentation, I want you to know that it is a work in progress. And so you will be seeing some components of the piece that will be a finished product, hopefully by the end of this year. So we will start in just a second. Okay. So welcome to the 9th Annual Humanities Days events at Montgomery College. My name is Cinder Cooper-Barnes, and I am the host of the day's event, Juke Joints in Jesus, the subversiveness of African-American joy in times of struggle. I want to play for you the introduction to our piece, my project. My videographer and photographer was Aquil Waters. Hopefully he'll be joining us a little bit later today.
Welcome to Cinder Seeking, an education website focused on various aspects of the Black experience in the United States. This year, we look at the secular and sacred, Juke Joints and Jesus in the Gullah Geechee corridor of South Carolina. In the blog post, Giving Voice to a Hidden History, Establishing the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, Michael Allen writes, the Gullah people, known as Geechee in some places, are the descendants of enslaved Africans brought from West Africa to work on rice and indigo plantations that extended from St. Johns River in Florida to Cape Fear River in North Carolina. Allen continues, the Gullah people's language, food, and religion came from their native homelands of Africa. These cultural identities merged with the experiences forced upon them in North America, creating distinctive and rich art forms, language, and music that has been integral to our American fabric. I would add to Allen's list the creation of all Black spaces for the free expression of those cultural striving. So before we can begin a discussion of the secular and sacred and their role in Southern Black communities, in particular the Gullah Geechee community, we must delve into the conditions in which these two subversive incarnations of Black survival and joy, the Juke Joint and Church, arose. Why these two spaces? Because the story of Black pain in the Americas is well documented, even by those who would gloss over it in their telling of the birth and growth of the United States as a superpower. Most of us know, however, the minutest of details of the triangular slave trade, but seeing it presented as an animation demonstrates even more clearly the odds against our ancestors surviving, thriving, and somehow finding joy. We may have seen diagrams of the unsanitary bellies of slave ships with our ancestors packed in, layered on top of one another, left to swelter in each other's excrement. We may have learned, at least superficially, through textbooks and films, of the backbreaking labor and exploitation of their knowledge, skill, and craftsmanship. Evidence of the cruelty and indignities committed against our forebears exists in the forms of photographs, artistic renderings, tools of torture, bills of sales, and runaway posters, and the buildings where these atrocities took place often still stand in the South. As the evidence of horrors continue to be found, we are not surprised. We mourn again.
It was almost considered an urban legend for one Horry County community, but a recent discovery now brings forth truth and history. And now that the residents have found it, they're determined to make sure this significant piece of land is never forgotten again. WMBF News Today anchor Christelle Bell takes us there.
Lost but now found. That's how many of the descendants of the Bucksport community are feeling after recently discovering this cemetery with their ancestors. Now, it's still in the preliminary stages of finding all of the grave sites out here, but some of these grave sites date back as far as the 17 and 1800s.
We found you. We found you. Because, you know, you hear about it and it becomes like a legend. It's almost like Bigfoot. You know, does it really exist?
Deep in the forest, it does exist. Now part of the Bucksport community, once known as Bucks Township, you'll find the Eddy Lake Cemetery.
A carving that what appears to be a cow.
Always said to be here, but no one never knew exactly where it was located until recently. Mary Owens can take the credit for the discovery. She's the self-proclaimed historian of Bucksport and says as a child she heard the stories of Eddy Lake.
Often they talked about Eddy Lake, how their parents worked at the sawmill at Eddy Lake.
And it was the stories of her great-great-grandfather, Reverend John Mishu, a well-respected traveling preacher, that prompted her curiosity.
Your great-grandfather's buried at Eddy Lake. And I decided at that point I was going to find my great-grandfather.
Determined to leave no stone unturned to find her lost relative, she followed the trail.
I took the 1860 census, which does not give our name, only a number, the owner, and the number of slaves it had.
Yeah, this is ground zero for our growth in Horry County.
Left behind by her ancestors that led her here.
I was connected to this area. Immediately, as I took a step out here, I said, oh, this is it.
Sure enough, it was just as simple as walking through the woods, and they've been here, you know, waiting on us all this time.
Reporting from the Bucksport community in Horry County, Christelle Bell, WMBF News.
But in the midst of our shared trauma, there are facets of Black joy that we can discuss, along with the litany of our pain and the injustices enacted upon us. It is not either or neither nor. Because overcoming is second nature to African Americans, what we might take for granted is that since our ancestors' arrival on the shores of the Americas, of South Carolina, of the Gullah Geechee corridor, we have been making a way out of no way. Tragically, beautifully, gracefully, awkwardly, we made a way. We are the descendants of a people who survived conditions unfathomable to most, treatment of the most cruel kinds, rape, torture, and all other manner of inhumanity, under the system of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and other forms of legalized systemic oppression. Yet they sought and found, as we continue to seek today in this American wilderness, solace, comfort, joy, and respite. When they could, they carved out secret and not-so-secret sanctuaries in plain sight. Sanctuaries both sacred and secular. And their joy in those spaces, those sanctuaries, was just as revolutionary as raising arms. Before and after the Civil War, they found these sanctuaries.
Okay. So we want to move on here with a poem that I discovered in my research. Twilight descends on the Delta, the juke joints open. Cars with broken taillights and beaten up empty pickups with mud splash flaps collapse on the shoulders of the road. Men charred by the sun and tired of the monogamy of cotton check into these hospices for the blues. With pain so thick, you could cut it with a buzzsaw and send bales up north on one of those endless freights, sounding like snare drums and screeching harmonicas. Inside, the music wraps around jilted lovers with gold teeth and slumped at the bar as if in a trance, wounded with sorrow shots. Whatever happened, one asked, to that woman with a ramshackle smile and whose wide, come my way swinging hips that promised me forever, but with one wink brought more agony than a mule felled by fire ants. A cadaver-looking lover with yellow eyes and a raspy voice mouths lyrics about why anyone could ever believe a woman with bare shoulders and disheveled hair. Newlyweds dance pocket to pocket, but her eyes keep spotting a sultry beau whose smile, like a hook, will pull her away from her too soon stale vows. When the Juke closed, everyone has caught the blues, and like a fever, it takes freezing rain to put it out. And the summer of betrayals has just started. This poem is by Philip Collin. He is an American poet. This poem was published in 2019, so we can see the allure of the juke joint still stands. There are some problematic aspects to this poem that we'll get into later, but I'm not gonna get into it right now. So I wanna talk a little bit about how I came to this project. I'm gonna go back here for a second. How I came to this project. In the summer of 2019, I had the option to participate in an ACLS project. ACLS is the American Council of Learned Societies, who offered a fellowship for community college faculty. And those of you who are at the community college know that the one thing that we have very little of is time. So the American Council of Learned Societies really offered community college faculty, both full and part-time, the opportunity to have time to do research on passion projects. So my interest was definitely in juke joints for as far as I can remember. But what I didn't see and didn't know that it was something that people were looking at as an academic exercise. And so I wanted to make connections between the juke joint and the church. I had nothing to lose. So I'd been thinking about this for 20 years. And to be honest, my interest has always been more on the juke joint side of things than on the church side of things. But I am a Southern woman and grew up seeing and being somewhat influenced by both. I lived within walking distance of 2 juke joints and a church. The Shackadelic Shack, which was just a hop, skip, and a jump away from me, is where I spent my summer afternoons. My afternoons after school and my summers during the day. Now you're like, wait a minute, you're a child and you spent time in a juke joint. Well, juke joints weren't really juke joints during the day. They became juke joints at night. Juke joints are these kind of informal establishments that are extra legal. And when I say extra legal, that means they were not necessarily operating inside the bounds of the law. They didn't have licenses, for instance. They didn't have the license to sell alcohol. They didn't have commercial kitchens. They didn't have licenses to serve as gambling establishments, but they often did. Most of them did. But during the day, they were often just country stores where you can get snacks, you can get some, I'm gonna date myself and show you just how country I am. You could get some, pickled pig feet. I know, right? You're like, what? You can get a Red Rock soda, you can get, bags of chips for a quarter, things like that. So this was my childhood, and the Shackadelic Shack was owned by my great aunt Irene and her husband, my uncle Albert. And right through a path through the woods was another juke joint, which was called Gamble's Grill. And then right down the street from that was a church called Midway Church. It wasn't my church, but it was a church. So I didn't attend that church, but it was one that we often went to for summer lunch programs because, hey, we're in the South. So I am going to go into more detail about what the juke joint is later, but I did want to talk a little bit about how these establishments are predecessors to the modern club, but they are also contemporaries of the modern club in that juke joints still exist to this day. In fact, I visited some this summer. So this project does work to a degree to explore the influence of the church, but really it's looking at religious practices as a part of the development of the juke joint. So this project aims at exploring two incarnations of African-American cultural vernacular traditions as embodied and symbolized by the brick and mortar, the church and the juke joint, but it's more than that. The church and the juke joints are not just establishments, they are mindsets, they are cultures, they are ways of life. So some people really get their taste of the juke joint from the color purple. And so by seeing Harpo's place in the color purple, people were exposed, broader culture was exposed to the juke joints. I wanted to go back to the parts of the project. My photographer is here and I'll let him talk a little bit later if he wants to share, if people have questions about this and how he put these beautiful images together and in the video together. So he will say hi a little bit later. I just put him on the spot. He didn't know that I was going to do that, but he doesn't have to get on camera. But anyway, I just wanted to talk about the parts of the project. So you all saw the introduction, which we are still working on. But after the introduction, there is background. There is background about the Gullah Geechee community. There is background on the African influences of both the church and the juke. There's background on the subversiveness of Black joy and survival. Then there is a section on the church. Then there's a section on Black enclaves along the Gullah Geechee corridor. And what we mean by enclaves is communities that arose during Reconstruction, where Black people gathered together and pooled their money to create their own sanctuaries because they weren't allowed access to some of the venues in the white communities. So of course, this is Jim Crow South. So there were beaches that we visited, enclaves that we visited that still exist. Some have gone the way of the dinosaur. But then we look more carefully and deeply into the juke joint itself. So those are the parts of the project that we are working on. And all of these parts will come together in a website called Cinder Seeking. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you might want to know how I made this connection between the juke and the church. And let me just say that the juke is both a noun and a verb, right? There's the juke joint, there's the place, but then there's the juke, there's activity, it's an action, juking, dancing, merrymaking, etc. But there is that connection that we have with the church. Long before the physical Black church existed, religious traditions rooted in ancestor worship, animism, Islam, and non-Judeo-Christian cosmologies were brought from West Africa and practiced in secret. And so what I've noticed in my research is that there wasn't this distinction, this big distinction between the secular and the non-secular. And so I wanted to keep that tradition going by examining them together. Professor Katrina Hazard-Donnell of Rutgers University wrote in the book, Jukin, The Rise of Social Dance Formations in African-American Culture, that social dancing links African-Americans to their African past more strongly than any other aspect of their culture. Dance is not only a routine communal activity, but an integral part of ceremonies that bind groups together as people. It links one's personal identity to that of the group. Events throughout the life cycle of the individual and community are connected, commemorated with dance, fattening house dances, fertility dances, and rite of passage dances, end quote. And of course, dance connected the people to the gods, to the ancestors, to the earth, to the universe. And so therein lies the foundation of the Juke, or the Juke joint. So when I talk about the Black church and the Juke joint, I talk about them as two sides of the same coin. There really is no leap for me in melding these two physical incarnations of Black joy and survival. Of course, there would be probably in my community, my grandmother would, if she were alive, would have a fit that I'm putting these two things together. But even she would recognize that there is connection there. There is no leap because traditionally, as Hazard Gordon asserts, for most Africans, the social and religious community are the same. And so that is how I approach this project. I wanted to talk a little bit about this dichotomy of good and evil that is present in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that's spread throughout the Americas and Africa. And that is why we rarely discuss these intersecting relationships between the church, and I'm going to say this with quotation marks, the club, right? So the church and the club. And you'll notice that I'm putting them in quotation marks because I don't really mean one church. I mean religiosity in the Americas as it's constructed, okay? So we think about them as being separate, as one being good, one being evil, but really they are not, because we know that the owners of juke joints were often the biggest supporters of the church. They were the biggest tithers. They were the informal bankers. They were the brokers of peace in the community. And so even though those who found themselves in church on Sunday may not have been in the juke on Saturday night, we do know that there is connection between the two. And so I won't separate them either. I do want to show you a couple of clips that really highlight the similarity. As we see this first version here, this first clip about Black Delta religion, you'll notice how we can make the connection between that and the church. This is a clip from Folkstreams.net. We do have permission to use this. I want you to pay attention to the music, the sound, and the movement. So as we move into this clip, by the way, this was a film made with super 8mm footage captured by William Farris in rural Mississippi in 1968. And so while this clip is from rural Mississippi in 1968, it is very similar to what we saw or what we see in rural areas of South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, et cetera. So this is not very different from the way my church family grew in rural South Carolina. So we did the baptism at the river as well. We didn't have the baptismal pools nice and clean and everything. We went down to the river and got baptized. But the music there is what I wanted us to pay attention to. And I also wanted us to just think about the difference in how, even though these traditions were adopted by African Americans, they were also adapted by African Americans. And so as we look at those previous slides, we'll see that we did not give up everything once we were kidnapped and brought to the Americas. We retained some of our cultural traditions, some of our religious traditions, and just melded them with Christianity, if we indeed accepted Christianity at all. So I want us to take a look now at the second clip, which really is a nice segue between that Black Delta religion clip and the music that we saw there. This particular piece is from a movie called, let me make sure I have this right. I think it was The Blood of, I'm gonna have to go back to my notes, but I will let it play. This is a clip from this particular movie, and it is in my notes sourced at the end, so you can take a look at it there. This was a piece from 1941.
Did you want us to see the video?
Yes.
Yeah, but can't see the video.
Okay, so apparently some of you can't see the video. Okay, so you can, well, at any rate, as long as you could hear the music from The Blood of Jesus, and this was called Juke Joint Swing, and that was in 1941, from a movie from 1941. So were we able to see Black Delta Religion, any video from that?
Yes, that was played.
Okay, so it could just be the size of my screens here, but I will save this for you all and you can take a look at it later. But what I wanted us to notice in both of these is just the sound that we have there. And the similarities in the transition in the music, how we move from the non-secular to the secular. And we might come back if we have a chance to take a look at that video a little bit later. I can find it. But what I wanted us to see now is a little bit about the modern incarnation of the juke joint. This particular place that we have, again, this is by my photographer, Phil Waters, who's here, is in Mosquito Beach, South Carolina. This is off James Island off in Charleston, South Carolina. And as we note, as an anthropological area of study, it has been less than about 100 years that we have attempted to examine the juke joint and the church together. But particularly, it's only been about 100 years since we've started studying the juke joint. And that was with Zora Neale Hurston's Characteristics of Negro Expression. And she describes the juke joint as a Negro body house. Okay, so we want to make sure that we can recognize that this modern incarnation has been around for about 100 years. So as Zora Neale Hurston defined the juke joint as a Negro pleasure house, it may mean a body house, it may mean a house set apart on public works where the men and women dance, drink, and gamble. Often it is a combination of all of these. Musically speaking, the juke is an important place in America, for in its smelly, shoddy confines has been born the secular music known as the blues. And on the blues has been founded jazz. Okay, so when we think about this, these connections, we know that there is a start with the church. In fact, Gates has said, Henry Louis Gates has said that there's a long and controversial tradition of Saturday night sneaking into church on Sunday morning. And so these spaces really deserve to be preserved, and they deserve to be acknowledged as a part of the American cultural tradition. And so as we move forward in these last slides, I wanted to just share with you some of what we did this summer. So when we think about the juke joints, we know that they arose with the founding of Black communities. And these Black communities arose outside of the sites of former plantations often.
So Cinder, I have a question for you. As far as like condemnation, were there any condemnation for people who attended the joint and did not attend the church, or vice versa?
Well, I certainly think that there was condemnation from those who were churchgoers to those who spent time at the juke joint, certainly. Even those who were the proprietors of juke joints might have gotten some condemnation, but because they were economic powerhouses in the community, that went a long way because they were able to support the church. They were able to support the community. In fact, the juke joint owners would be people who were really driving forces in the economic development of the community. And that was a way that they moved into the middle class often.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Thank you. It does, thank you.
And Professor Barnes, this is Vincent Briley. A question that comes from your title is about joy. Can you speak about how Black people use joy and weaponize joy in this context, either or the church or the juke joint?
Yeah, I think that it is in that it's so subversive, right? That what you had were these establishments, particularly the juke joints, operating in secret. In fact, one of the juke joints that we visit, quite several of them actually, they did not want us to record inside. They didn't want to be on camera. They did not want to be recorded, have their voices recorded, because they know that this was really clandestine. And so this was a place where you had freedom of movement, as I had one person tell me. You could be free from the oppression that went on outside of the walls. Now, of course, things happened inside the juke joints that stayed inside the juke joint, but it was a place where you weren't monitored, right? You weren't monitored by the larger community, by the dominant part of society. So that really enabled them to have this kind of reckless joy. And we see that also in the church. This is an unmonitored place. This is where you could speak your mind. When we think about liberation theology, it comes from these all Black churches where you could talk also about politics, also about trying to get your human rights, your civil rights. So all of this we have in the form of these buildings, but in the actions that took place in the building, whether it was through singing, sermonizing, dancing, etc., we know that there is a connection between the two. I hope that answered your question, Vincent.
There's another question in the chat. Does there continue to be a present day connection? This is from Shelley Jones. Does there continue to be a present day connection between the church and the juke joint in the South? Is there a northern equivalent?
Okay, I would say yes, there's still a connection, simply because there is going to always be this connection between the secular and the non-secular in terms of how we move and operate freely. And so that still happens in the church, and it still happens in the juke joint. And juke joints also, one of the things that we didn't get to is how they arose, right? So they were first barrel houses that emerged in the 1890s. They were called barrel houses. Again, you can guess what was in the barrels, but they were barrel houses. And again, where music was played, we can see rag kind of started there, ragtime, even though people didn't dance to rag. But so we saw these communal spaces, these kind of clandestine spaces where Black people got together and were free to be themselves without the watchful eye of their oppressors right there, waiting to just jump on them. So, but with the advent of the jukebox, or as we call it in the South, the piccolo, there was this really democratizing aspect of the jukebox, in that you could hear Black music played, race music played, whenever you wanted to, if you went to a juke joint, because you can get a song played for a nickel, or 3 songs for a dime. And so you were able to hear Black music, even if you weren't able to get it played on the radio with any regularity. So it became like an equalizing force and an economic powerhouse, even when people were still utilizing live music. The jukebox came in and offered some variety there. But the equivalent in the North, I would say, arose a little bit later, and that would be during Prohibition. So the juke joint came around really before Prohibition, but the speakeasy in the North would probably be the equivalent to the juke joint. Again, it's secret, it's selling alcohol illegally, and it had illegal kitchens, et cetera. So that would have been the equivalent. But we have seen the spread of the juke joint since then. So there are juke joints littered all over the country, even though they are mainly in the South, but you can find them in some cities as well. Shelley, I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cinder. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And Professor Cornelius has a question as well. And I kind of have a corollary question, actually. Professor Cornelius says, has integration taken place in juke joints, i.e. whites stopping in for the music as in 1930s jazz clubs? And my question was going to be how much co-optation of juke joints has happened. I'm thinking in particular of like Fat Possum Records in the Delta, which was a record label that popularized a particular juke joint there, or even the kind of folk revival of the 50s and 60s that sometimes is looked at as co-optive. So a question about integration in juke joints as in 1930s jazz clubs, and then corollary maybe about any kind of problematic aspects of that.
I would say absolutely. There has been some co-optation, commercialization. There has also been integration, particularly in those that have been popularized, and that would be in Mississippi. The Mississippi juke joint, which is the one that we know the most about, which is the one that has been researched the most in the South, has certainly been commercialized and exploited in so many different ways. They are tourist attractions. It is the juke joint capital of the world, Marigold, Mississippi, and the state of Mississippi in general, that whole Mississippi Delta. And so, yes, people go into them as tourists, more so than just for the entertainment aspect of it. It's still secret, though. You're not going to get, as an outsider, and that could be of any race, you're not going to get everything that you would get as a local. You're going to get a very sanitized version if they dare to give you even that. So entree into these places is pretty difficult if you don't know. A lot of the places that we went to, if you didn't know that where they were, you weren't going to ever, somebody had to take you there, right? Somebody had to take you there. Somebody had to let somebody know you were coming. It's all of these types of things. But yeah, we've seen it. If you think about House of Blues, I think we've all heard of House of Blues. That is a sanitized, very sanitized version of, whitewashed version of a juke joint. That is what they modeled the House of Blues on, is the Mississippi Delta and the juke joint there. So usually you need, I would say, a chaperone. You need someone from the community to take you into a juke joint. Stopping in, though, people are pretty private because there are lots of things that go on there that are extra legal, as I said before. So you need to have a connection in, particularly to the ones that are really rural. In Mississippi, of course, where you have the juke joint corridor, you have the this very tourist attraction. There are some where people are more welcome than others, but even those things happen when you leave, right? Things are going to happen when the foreigner, and I call it foreigner, anyone who's not in the community, will leave. So, but yeah, people, it is more integrated. But again, it's going to be integrated by people within the community. And so when I say community, in that town, in that area, so there might be a little bit more mixing of races there, but there likely won't be a lot of mixing of economic statuses. So that would be where you still see some discrepancies. Did that answer your question at all?
It did mine. I won't speak for Professor Kournitis.
And I'd also like to say that when I approached this, I did the research and I noticed that very few of the people researching this were from the African-American community. Very few were from the South. And so who is engaged? Would anybody like to guess who's engaged in this research right now? And you can just unmute yourself or type in the chat. Who do you think is engaged in the research on juke joints?
Our people. This is Ellen.
What kind of people?
White people.
Oh, okay, yes. And mostly white men. White men have a fascination with the juke joint. And that's probably because of
it's cool, baby. It's cool.
Yes. And there's this kind of outlaw nature to it that is attractive to people. And so I'd say 90% of the research on juke joints, you can Google this, you can look in our databases for articles, just type in juke joint. You'll see that most of the scholars are white men. And if you look at, remember the poem that I shared earlier, that was by a white poet. And so when I was doing this, getting this proposal ready, getting this project and presentation ready, I just Googled, juke joint poems, saw the same patterns over and over and over again. And so part of it is, I think, is we just take for granted this in our community, this wealth of culture in our community. I know I certainly did. When I was growing up, I didn't really see the intrinsic value of it. So it wasn't until I was an adult and had moved away that I started really appreciating the richness of the culture of the juke joint and the church. So even going back, we went to 5 communities up and down the Gullah Geechee corridor. That would be Highway 17 from Atlantic Beach, which is part of Myrtle Beach, on down to St. Helena Island. We interviewed about 14 people. We were in 5 communities. And even the community that I grew up in, I have been gone for 30 years. So I had to prove my insiderness to get access. And I still needed like a chaperone to go in and say, hey, she's cool. Or, classmates who now own them and say, okay, yeah, I remember her, she's cool. So that was very fascinating.
That is very interesting. A couple other clusters of questions coming in on the chat. Here's 2 that are kind of related about the etymology of the word juke, where juke comes from, and also related to whether juke joint refers to a community, a group behavior, dance, music, or jazz, etc.
Okay, so some believe that juke is a West African word brought over with the enslaved people. Some people think it's a Gullah word. So of course it makes sense that there would be the 2. Gullah is a Creole language spoken in the coastal regions of South Carolina and Georgia. And so it's a Gullah word, but that word has origins in West African languages. So the juke, body behavior, bad behavior is the reference there. So it's about a behavior. It's about action. Body, B-A-W-D-Y, behavior. And so that's where Zora Neale Hurston, how she describes the etymology of the term. But there are similar terms in the West African tradition, particularly among the Rice Coast, which is where most Gullah Geechee people are from, who are still in the Sea Islands and coasts of South Carolina and Georgia. I think I forgot the second part of that question. Oh, is it a behavior? What was it?
So it's so the previous question was from Theta. Thank you, Theta. And then Wenso asks, juke joint, the term juke joint, a community, a group behavior, dance, music, jazz.
Okay, so yeah, the juke joint itself is a place. Juking would be the behavior, the activity. So again, it is the cousin, I'd say the older cousin, the auntie, the grandmother of what we would consider the club now. But most clubs today have to have licenses. So they have business licenses. But the juke is an informal establishment. It can be in anything. We visited juke joints this summer that were no more than she sheds, a couple of she sheds put together, those storage, Cheryl she shed. There were like 2 of them put together, and that was a juke. You could have these informal kind of storage buildings that just became establishments. So they're informal. They sometimes sell alcohol indiscriminately and illegally without a license. And this is the part that's almost revolutionary and resistance oriented. They don't want to pay the taxes, or they can't pay the taxes for these alcohol license or for these businesses. They have kitchens that aren't commercial kitchens, but there is food to be found there. So there is gambling that, of course, is not regulated that occurs there. And that's why they are so subversive in that they are, operating under the radar oftentimes. So it's both the behavior and the place.
Thank you. Professor Bess points out in the chat that the word juke can also be used to describe the action of escaping. Capture, he says, to juke someone. I juked.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Bess.
Juke and jive, right? A couple other questions here. Did you discover anything that took you by surprise during your research?
That's a great question. I think what took me by surprise is I got this fellowship in July of 2020. So that was the height of COVID. So I really couldn't do a whole lot. Churches were online, they were streaming. Jukes, even then, they were like even careful about COVID. So really we got to do this work in this summer, and there's still the reluctance to gather. So we did notice that, people were paying attention to the quarantine orders and things like that. What surprised me is that I was seen as an outsider. Like even me, I was seen as an outsider, even though I approached this subject saying, hey, I'm an insider, I'm one of you. I am not looking at this from this kind of object-oriented perspective. I am a part of this community and I want to tell, your stories. I want to preserve your stories. And, but there was still distrust. And so that was surprising to me, that, there was that distrust there. What are you going to do with this information? And they have, a lot of reason to be, very careful, because again, when you're extra legal, you can't risk exposure. So I want to share with you all this PowerPoint so you can take a look, because there are some videos from clips in some of the interviews that we've done. And I want to share that with you so that you can have access to it. Really great information from my cousins who participated, who owns a juke joint and who grew up around them. But also some places where we couldn't record inside, right? But we got a night version, a day version from the outside. And we really, I think, understood that, yeah, you're from here, but you're gone. You don't have to live here. We do. And so some of the land is prime land as well. And so people are trying to keep their land. They don't want it to be, commercialized or developed. So people are looking for any reason to snatch people's land. And so operating in this way is risky still. So that was a surprise to me.
You're describing kind of an anti-authoritarian or an anti-authority kind of a feel for it. Would you go so far as to say it's anti-capitalist, or is that naive?
I would say that part might be a little bit naive because, again, these are economic engines. These juke joints, particularly the ones that started in the 50s, some of the ones that we looked at started in the 50s and 60s. They started as a way to give people an opportunity for entrepreneurship. It was a way to get out of the cotton fields, tobacco fields. It was a way to get away from sharecropping. So it was in this kind of capitalist entrepreneurial spirit that these places started to arise. And what it did for at least a couple of the interviewees is their parents and grandparents who own these juke joints were able to send their kids to college. And so they were part of like this new middle class who their parents may not have gone to college, but they have a business sense. So very capitalistic in that way. But again, there was a resistance orientation along with that too. We're going to be capitalists, but we know that capitalism isn't set up for us to be successful. So we are going to flout your rules. We are going to sell the alcohol out of, this was a very entrepreneurial and very creative thing that we had heard about, is one place, I won't mention the name, they had a soda machine. And in its heyday, because they kept getting busted by, I think it's SLED, it was what it's called in South Carolina, but they kept getting busted. People kept turning them in. So they put their beer and alcohol in soda machines. You just had to know which number to push to get the beer to come out. So you might have wanted a Coke, but you were going to get malt liquor or something. So there are ways that they flouted the system. You know, those kitchens where they sold fish sandwiches or chicken sandwiches or whatever they sold, without being rated by, you know, the health department. So very capitalist, but in their own way. As we do with anything, we adapted it.
That goes some way toward answering, as well as some other things you said. Another question that's come in from Theda. How do juke joints stay under the radar? You mentioned having to have a chaperone, having to know somebody who gets you in. Any other information about how juke joints can stay under the radar? I mean, I imagine there is some sort of, at least unofficial, relationship sometimes with those who could get you in trouble.
Yes. I don't know whether my cousin Trinitha is here or not. She signed up for it, but she was one of my interviewees. It was her aunt's place that we looked at, one of them. But as we talked about, because these are so rural, you have to really be searching for them to find them. And even looking at them, you might not be sure what it actually is. So there isn't going to be a sign. Most of them won't have signage. There's not going to be a regular operating hours. It's when the owners feel like coming that they open the doors. If you see a car there, that means, hey, baby, you can go in. So it is in plain sight. What we've seen is that there are these businesses operating in plain sight, but not really, because they're in such rural communities. Even those that were in the town part of our town, the town that I grew up in. And some of you would know this, some of my cousins would know this, you know, the up the track, which would be Juke Joint Alley in Kingstree, South Carolina, which is where I'm from. Lots of illegal activities happen there, but very seldom really did any, you know, violence happen until the kind of crack epidemic happened. And so that's when things started getting violent and things started evolving or devolving, if you would call it that. So what we noticed is that you had insiders. Some people knew what was happening, particularly in law enforcement, but they did not bother you unless you really did something outrageous. And so if you got hurt at a juke joint, you would not call the police. You know, somebody had a gun, which was rare, you know, you would not call the police. But if somebody did happen to get shot, you would take them away to the hospital. The ambulance would not come, that kind of stuff. So I don't know whether that answered your question or not, Theta, but yeah, part of it is that people don't really know, and those who do know appreciate its value. And so they don't tell because they want to have that space.
Thank you.
So few things like that these days.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from, so we're about 5 minutes out from 1:45, but I'm certainly not going to let this one go by in the chat. This is another question from Professor Bess, who, by the way, is a wonderful poet of the blues.
Yes.
The question is, in North Carolina, I found that juke joint owners and root doctors had these sort of nicknames. Do you recall any?
Okay, yes, actually I do. There are a few. So my cousin, one who we interviewed, and I'll share the PowerPoint since you all didn't get to see the interview, but her name, her place was called T's, and her nickname was T. There was a place called, the one that I talked about earlier, that was Gamble's Grill. It was later called Monkey Joe's for the son of the owner. Samuel Barr, Monkey Joe, he died this summer, but he owned and ran a juke joint when I was growing up. So there's one called Fats. His nickname is Fat. So yeah. And again, that's a way that you can stay kind of under the radar. If people don't really know what your name is, what your full name is, they can't really get you. So yeah, there are lots of nicknames there. And there's lots of connections, I think, for Professor Best with, hoodoo, root working, et cetera, as those kind of areas of the culture that connect all together with Christianity, with the church, with the Juke, and that combination of secular and non-secular cosmologies.
So we're about 5 minutes out here from 1:45. So there's kind of a few questions here, and maybe I'll just kind of give them all and see if any of them strike a chord.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Are juke joints multi-generational? Do they get passed down to younger sons, etc.? That's one. The question is sons, but I think I heard aunts and daughters before, maybe.
Yeah, and can I just respond to that? So juke joints they are also, I mean, if somebody wanted to do a dissertation on this, it would be interesting, but they were kind of these feminist organizations, right? In that women owned as well as men, even from the earliest incarnations of them, women were owning them and they were partners with their husbands if they were married. So that's one thing. So yes, they could be passed down. And I did notice that a few of them were passed down. But I also noticed in our trips this summer that some were new, some were from people. My classmate owned a juke joint and he was the first in his family, but he grew up in the same ones that I did. And remember when we say juke joints, when we were visiting them as kids, they were just corner stores. They were just stores, country stores that were jukes at night. So often these juke joints had, multiple purposes. They weren't just juke joints all the time. They were juke joints after dark and on the weekends, right? But during the day, they served other purposes. So a classmate of mine who just kind of took the model that we grew up with and opened his own establishment out there in the country that you cannot find unless you are absolutely looking for it. So, but yeah, some of them are passed down. But the problem with that, as a lot of you know, is that when you're in a rural community, the economic situation is such that there aren't a lot of jobs. So a lot of young people leave and those establishments close because people leave and don't come back home.
And then a couple more real quick. We just have a minute or so here. Could you tell us more about the cemetery that was mentioned in your video at the beginning and the historian of that community? It sounded like oral history led to the discovery of this burial place. And then just another one, do you miss it, is the question. Okay,
so the Bucksport community in Horry County, South Carolina, that is along the Gullah Geechee corridor. Horry County is a county that Myrtle Beach is in, so most people have heard of Myrtle Beach. Horry County, Bucksport is a little bit inland from Myrtle Beach, and we have discovered, people are discovering old slave cemeteries all over the place, not only in Horry County, but all over South Carolina, all over the South. And even in the North, they're finding them. So yeah, usually it is a community historian who has this interest, who does genealogy, who's heard from this place and that place. And then they get the historical society to come in and help them find it. So this is happening all the time. Thankfully, this was a community that wasn't being developed, and then they unearthed these cemeteries, these graves. But sometimes that's how it happens. Someone is developing property, and then they find these cemeteries, which were not taken care of, which were not really revered as resting places for the ancestors. The other question is, do I miss it? Do I miss being back in rural South Carolina? I'm gonna say sometimes. I miss the community. I certainly had a different attitude going back this time. I didn't think that I would miss it the way that I did, or that I would appreciate it the way that I did coming back. And so I certainly looked at it with new eyes, and I do have this appreciation for it that I didn't have when I was living there and growing up there. But I do get back often. So my family, I still have family there.
Well, I think I can speak for everybody when I say thank you so much for holding forth on this topic. It is really, really interesting to hear you talk about this this topic, and I can't wait to hear more from you about it.
Thank you. And we are putting together the website, so a lot of this stuff will be on a website as well by the end of the year. And again, I will be sharing the PowerPoint, maybe posting it somewhere. I think the other members of the Humanities Days Committee will help me figure out how to best share that with you all, since you weren't able to see the entire PowerPoint or the entire presentation. So thank you for allowing me to share this with you all. It was a great experience.